Hello, hello.
Yeah.
They don't need to use this one.
Oh, but do we?
No, only.
The intro?
Are about production consumption systems, are about businesses, companies, or organizations of any kind, and also recently about cities. And I have worked in the context of all of these systems of different scale. Then I have, after 8.5 years in New Zealand, I moved to Melbourne to undertake a postdoctoral research project, which I'm going to talk about today briefly. And then I lived there for 3 years. Then in 2016, I moved. It's on mute now.
No.
Oh, yeah.
Perfect. I'm back from the break.
Where was I? Yes, Melbourne. So I lived in Melbourne for 3 years, amazing city. Then I moved to Aalto University to undertake my professorship in 2016. So it's been only a little bit longer than 2 years that I've been living in this amazing city, that's Helsinki. So, just a bit of a background. I'm sure some of you already know this very well and some of you may not. But we have overshot the planetary boundaries, the systems that actually basically help us to have a viable human society, human life on planet Earth. And we also are underperforming in all of these social foundations, because sustainability is not only about environment and ecosystems, it's also about society. And that's why it is very complex to handle. It is now very well established in practice as well as in, of course, theory, that structural, long-term, radical transformations are necessary in socio-technical ecological systems. And some of them are already happening, and some of them are urgently needed, and some of them are just starting to unfold. But what is a socio-technical system? For example, mobility is a socio-technical system because it has social as well as technological elements that operate to create a particular function that the society needs in a very entangled way. Similarly, food is a socio-technical system. Shelter, housing is a socio-technical system. And energy is also another socio-technical system. So, although by many transitions are formulated or framed as linear and mostly technological challenges, my work indicates that transitions are actually complex and threefold design challenges. So first and foremost, they're creative design challenges, because we need to conceive completely new systems that are going to meet the societal needs in sustainable ways. And that's a hugely creative, challenging task. Second, transitions are technical challenges, because, well, among these new system concepts, we need to be able to somehow evaluate and have an understanding of, we cannot be precise about this, but we can do our best to evaluate these new system concepts to understand which of the concepts are most promising in terms of assisting the society to transition to sustainability. And from those, of course, selected ones, we need to be able to design, develop, and deploy them. And that's a technical challenge, or the technical dimension of this complex challenge. And third, they're political design challenges. While transitions have a very large stakeholder base, namely actually the entire society, so there are a lot of stakes, a lot of vested interests, a lot of aspirations, some of which conflict with each other. And in order for us to be able to really mobilize transitions, we need to get the buy-in from, particularly from, key decision makers, but also, of course, we're living in democratic societies. You want people to be happy. You want people to be comfortable with the direction that the society is going. So we need designing participatory and democratic processes of deliberation, so that which systems are desirable, which systems are kind of seen as feasible to be deployed and developed, and which systems are sustainable can be discussed in depth. In fact, recently, a work that I did collaboratively with a colleague from Brunel University, UK, we looked at, okay, so the field of design for sustainability kind of started to emerge, or at least in a more kind of potent or powerful way, because we, of course, had pioneers like Buckminster Fuller and Victor Papanek, but it started to become something for the design field, mainstream design field, in 1980s, early 1990s. So we looked at, okay, so what has changed since the beginning of this field, how the field has evolved. And we have found that initially the field was focusing on artifacts, and isolating single issues to be solved, and the outlook, temporal outlook, was very short term. So designers as well as engineers were looking at, okay, how can we make a less polluting washing machine? And they were putting, for example, a filter to the outlet pipe. However, shortly after these endeavors started, we realized that this is actually not an effective direction. It's very incremental, and it is not going to get us where we need to go in the time frames that we need to. So the field, over a few decades, evolved to become a field that actually looks at systems rather than single issues, and also rather than trying to come up with artifact-related or product-level solutions, to systemic solutions. And the outlook, temporal outlook, has become longer term than only a couple of years or 5 years. And when we talk about longer term in the context of transitions, we're talking about 50 years and 100 years. And this is an incredibly long period of time for companies which need to, respond to emerging, quite daily challenges. But when it comes to, when you look at what kind of impacts we have on the environment, research tells us that at the moment, the impact that we are creating in the oceans will still be visible and felt in 100,000 years. So what we do has very long-term impacts. Therefore, we need to find ways to integrate business thinking and company strategy to be able to establish that link between the long-term and the short-term, long-term strategy and short-term action. And my PhD was about that. But I'm not going to get into the detail of that. So if we go back to how the field has evolved, we have identified 4 levels of sustainability-related innovation, which is product level, product service system level, spatial, social level, and socio-technical system level. And design for system innovations and transitions are located at the socio-technical system innovation level, but you can see from the back that it is related to all other levels, because in fact, in order to change anything at system level, yes, you do need to think systemically, but you also need to be able to connect that large, high-level thinking back into the micro, short-term products, services. So, design for sustainability transitions is about transforming socio-technical ecological systems to achieve sustainability through design and innovation. I'd like to call it, refer to it as SISU-proofing the future through design. I think we're in Finland, so I don't need to explain what this means. But this field integrates design research, design theories, with future studies, and with sustainability science and transitions theories. So it is an interdisciplinary field from a scholarly point of view, but it is a transdisciplinary field because our work is always in the real life. We work with cities, we work with companies, and we learn from each other. It's not like I go there to a company or to a city and dump my knowledge. It's a mutual learning process. That's why it is transdisciplinary research. And this is a rough guide for how you can approach you can approach design for sustainability transitions. It's very simplified, but that's why we have models. So initially, you need to understand what's wrong now. You need to look at the systems and you need to identify what needs to change. And we have actually to a large extent, a good understanding of what is wrong in the systems at the moment, from climate to energy to mobility to in general urban. And then the second step is co-developing future visions of desirable, alternative, sustainable futures. Whatever the system you're focusing on, you develop visions, future visions for those systems. And this is, it's a long-term vision, and there's no precise, time frame that you should use. We use 25 years. Some people use 50 years. We use 25 years because we have found out that 25 years is a relatable period. 50 years, people go a little bit sci-fi. 25 years is actually a good time frame because you can already see the seeds now for 25 years ahead. After you develop visions, and that's a process that requires engagement and participation, you backcast from those visions, trying to link the visions with the now. So it's of course not as simple as one line. There are methods that are developed to be able to do that a little bit effectively. It is difficult because at the moment what we have now is radically different than where we need to go or where we want to go. So it's not as simple as one line, but there are methods developed for that. But you, in essence, you backcast from those visions and ask yourself, okay, how can we start from now but move towards those futures? And then you identify small experiments that actually can kickstart the systems to move towards the visions. There's of course, huge design element in that. All of those experiments use design methods, either implicitly or explicitly. And then you observe, you learn from those experiments, and you make changes as you go. And you do this, let me repeat, in very participatory ways. But I would like to also highlight that although participation requires representation of all stakeholder groups in a system, in several participatory approaches, in transitions, you need to engage different types of stakeholders at different times of the process. For example, there's not much point in when you are developing future visions, particularly the technological feasibility related aspects, you need expert input. But for desirability aspect, you need any citizen. So it's quite a iterative, fun, but also very cognitively challenging process. So why visions? Well, although vision is a word that's very much so abused in management literature in 1990s particularly, in the transitions practice and theory, we understand visions as representations of alternative futures, futures that are alternative to what we have now. And the visioning process and the visions themselves can open up new conversations and assist with breaking from the existing perceptions and possibilities that underpin planning and design decisions. And the process of generating visions and the visions themselves can be considered as a feedback loop because they highlight tensions, portray existing practices that are seeds of alternative futures, and make new potential areas for innovation visible. So in Melbourne, I have worked in this project called Visions and Pathways 2040, which aimed to develop visions, scenarios and pathways for transitioning to low-carbon, resilient futures in Australian cities. And just to give you a bit of an idea on the kind of tensions you might need to navigate if you are involved in this kind of work is, 3 months after this project started, Australia elected a Prime Minister, Mr. Tony Abbott, who was a climate change denier. Not even, not even a Prime Minister who did not want to make policies that would assist with mitigation and adaptation, but he was a climate change denier. He said that climate change doesn't exist, and immediately started implementing policies that were very detrimental for, by that time, for a country which actually was the first to develop a very well-functioning carbon exchange system. He abolished all of that. He closed the Governmental Advisory Board Climate Council, which was giving policy advice to the government. The next day he came to power. So we had to navigate all of this emerging political tension. And you could see that our business partners, who were very interested when we were conceiving this project, they started to drift away because all of a sudden the political scene changed and they needed to adapt to it really fast. And this project was a large consortium project. So I was working at Victorian Eco-Innovation Lab in Melbourne School of Design. And we were collaborating with researchers from 2 different Australian universities. And it was a quite interdisciplinary team. I am a sustainability scientist, design researcher. We had an unorthodox economist. We had a social scientist and a geographer and a mathematical systems modeler in our team. Because the knowledge that you need to create is quite complex, you need very diverse teams for these projects. And we had business partners or partners from industry. Some of these are, you may know AECOM and Oricon, are international, very large engineering consultancies in the built environment sector. Hassel was an Australian but still very impactful, large architectural consultancy. And then we also had governmental entities as our partners. These included City of Melbourne, City of Sydney, Sydney Water, Government of South Australia, and ICLEI, which is a network of cities working about sustainability. And we used design-led methodologies, which means all of our processes of knowledge generation were participatory. They were very iterative. The project had creative, analytical, and integrative parts. It was transdisciplinary. And the timeline was between 2013 and 2016. So we kicked off in 2013. In 2014, we developed the visions through a series of workshops and working with professional designers. And in 2015, we developed scenarios. And 2016, by that time, I left the project, but my colleagues developed pathways. And this is a very simplified version of a quite messy process, but I'll try to explain everything that we kind of did. So we started with, of course, desktop research. We tried to understand what are those emerging technological and social changes that might assist with low carbon transitions. So we talked with social entrepreneurs, social innovators, as well as large companies and local government representatives to understand those emerging seeds of change. And also, of course, we did literature review. And then this was followed by visioning workshops. I think a total of 120 people participated in these workshops. And we did 2 workshops in Melbourne, 1 workshop in Sydney. Each workshop was followed by a week-long design charrette. So those design charrettes were our main means of integration. What does that mean? So as researchers, we had you know, kind of combined a vast array of literature knowledge and what is happening elsewhere and what are the drivers of change in cities, etc. So there's all of that literature knowledge in the research team. And then our professional designers were engaged with the participants in these visioning workshops. And after the workshops, researchers and designers, we got into a room and basically pulled our hair to make sense of our findings, coherent sense, so that we would create what we call critical glimpses of the futures that people have envisioned as desirable and low carbon. And we use these glimpses of futures, and some of them I have already shown here. All of these came out of the project, but there's a whole series of them in the project website that if you want you can use, because they're Creative Commons licensed. We use these glimpses of futures to have strategic conversations with stakeholders and partners. We also, in the meantime, of course, continued our desktop research. We interviewed some area experts to understand the seeds of change that we identified a little bit better. And then we integrated this knowledge into I think we had initially 6 prototype scenarios, which we then took to a scenarios workshop with participants. We worked our way through the scenarios, and eventually we released 4 alternative scenarios depicting low carbon Australian cities. And these are the scenario visualizations. There's also, of course, a huge amount of detail behind these, talking about food systems, mobility systems, how it is financed, what's the role of government, what's the role of business, etc., etc. But all of that we also visualized. So here what you can see is the columns show visualizations of different scenarios, and the rows show visualizations of the same scenario at different generic urban density levels. So this row is high density, this row is medium density, and this row is low density. And then just to give you an understanding of what these scenarios each were about, this scenario is about, we were kind of playing with the ideas of ecological modernization, price-driven efficiency, circular economy and service economy. This scenario is about centralized governance, social equality, egalitarianism, public service, and sustainable urbanism. And then in this scenario, we played with digitization and the trend towards freelance entrepreneurialism and the peer-to-peer innovations that are emerging, as well as collaborative economy, micro businesses, and it's a diverse, very diverse future, which is underlined by a lot of creativity. And then the final scenario is about localization, well-being, balanced living, and alternative forms of enterprises and exchange, as well as caring for the commons. And these scenarios fall. So, of course, we needed to all the time. What we did was related to carbon dioxide emission reductions. So you can reduce carbon dioxide emissions either by efficiency increases or by reducing consumption. And efficiency increase is the polemical politics of the neoliberal paradigm. And when we look at where on a spectrum of efficiency increase and consumption reduction, where each of these scenarios fall is, as you can see, the first scenario, clean tech market living, assumes that we can reduce carbon dioxide emissions by 80% mainly through increasing efficiencies, whereas on the other end of the spectrum, community balanced living scenario assumes that we can achieve 80% reductions, 80% emission reductions through reducing consumption radically, and the other two fold somewhere in between. And we also thought about, okay, these are very different futures, then how are they, you know, what are the governance models and who are the main actors in these futures? And what is the kind of the main value based? So these two main value base is egalitarianism, whereas these two main value base is meritocracy. And these two are top-down and centralized in terms of how they're governed, whereas these two are bottom-up and decentralized in terms of how they're governed. And based on this, the key actors in these futures in clean tech market living, it's the big corporation. In planned regulated living, it's the big government. In entrepreneurial network living, it's networks of freelance workers and prosumers, whereas in community balanced living, it's citizens and community organizations. And then it was, of course, very important to understand, given that these are quite idealized forms of futures, and future is very likely to be a mixture, a mosaic of all of these futures, we looked at, okay, so who are the proponents of these alternatives now? You need to understand, because these are actually your stakeholders in policy development as well as in experiment initiation. So of course, clean tech market living is mostly promoted by free market economists, some progressive businesses, and those people and organizations who are optimistic about what we can achieve with technology. And on the kind of the opposite end, in the community balanced living scenario, the proponents of this are transitionists, downsizers, degrowthers, and post-capitalists. And all of these actors exist at the moment in society, and their interventions are trying to push the unfolding futures towards their preferred desirable future. So, just now kind of wrapping up, I, on one hand, worked in this project as a researcher, as a design researcher. I also used the project as a case study to understand what roles design plays in transition processes. So in transition processes, there are three main activities that, that the project owners need to undertake. So these are strategic activities, which include formation of long-term goals and vision development, tactical activities, which is about implementing a change agenda, and operational activities, which is about coming up with experiments and learning by doing at the niche level. So based on my observations during workshops and analysis of workshop outputs, I have identified several roles that are played by design in transition processes, projects that can be mapped on these different activities. So as you can see, design has roles to play in each of these activities. And to my kind of, not necessarily to my surprise, because I of course had a hunch about it, but it's still surprising to see that only two of these roles are roles that are traditionally associated with what a designer does, and the rest is about soft skills, engagement skills, and strategic thinking skills that are more emerging roles and not necessarily in a widespread way associated with designers. And this has, of course, a lot of implications on how we teach design in design schools and what we teach students, which is now informing our new bachelor degree in design in Aalto, which is going to be launched next year. And then there are, of course, I have a couple of designer practitioners in my network trying to use these processes in their projects, and this is what they come up with when they, try to practice transition design or design for transitions. They come across challenges because design practice and professional culture of design is very different than how it's supposed to be in order to engage with transition processes more effectively. And also, what the clients expect from design agencies is different. You need to work with consortiums in transition projects, but in design agencies, you generally work with a single client. Anyhow, so these are the challenges that were identified by Helon in a recent project. So the first is that it's an emerging field. So the processes and methodologies are not solid yet. Or maybe to put it another way, methodologies and methods exist, but they're not necessarily designer friendly. There are not many cases that practicing designers can learn from and adapt in their practice. So it's a bit of a, whomever starts to engage with design for transitions has to do it, a little bit blindly. And the third challenge that was identified is transitions take long time to observe, measure, and learn. Therefore, as a commercial design agency, you don't necessarily have, the potential of showing indicators of success to whomever is paying you. And that's a huge challenge. And then fourth, the role of designers and the value of design and processes of transitions is just being explored, and it's not very clear. It's definitely not known by people who employ design agencies. And that's pretty much me. So thank you very much for your patience. And yeah.
So I was about to say, please save your questions till the end when we have the collective Q&A. Perfect. Thank you so much, Idil. And next we have Tanja Jäänicke, founder, producer, let me get this straight, yhteismaa, actionist, mesenaatti, something else.
Thank you.
I've never, this is like the first time I'm meeting
Oh,
Tanja,
yeah, sure.
so I'm a huge fan of all those things, and I'm super happy that she's going to be here now.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Battery's okay.
Yeah.
Do I need it?
The mic, yeah, because we're live streaming.
Okay, turn it off to put it in my pocket. Because I have no other place.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
It's coming there, it's there.
Okay, hello. I've lost my voice. Sorry. And also I have to tell that this is the first time I talk about this kind of issues in English. So normally when I talk I have maybe 5 slides. Now I have 50 slides because I'm more or less practicing myself. For me it's very easy to talk about these things in Finnish. But please support me if I lose some words. But anyway, yeah. We have a office called Actionist, and some say that we are expertise in participatory design, co-creation and peer financing. We try to create communities and innovative channels for participation and try to create tools to support people to participate. As he said, we are the founders of Mecenatime, which is the biggest and first crowdfunding platform in Finland. We are also founders of NGO called Yhteismaa that has created many many projects regarding and platforms regarding city culture, co-creation, participation. It all started beginning of 2012 when me and my colleagues got fascinated about these new possibilities of digitalization and social media. Suddenly we realized, after using Facebook actually, we realized that really the entire society has now possibility to network in a totally new way. And we are really on a journey from organization-centered society towards a human and community-centered oriented society, if we want so. So individual people, groups, they have much better tools to connect, to act, and therefore they have more power. And people really get to create things together more agile. People with same-minded people can meet in one night overseas and connect and get something big started. So we are in a situation that we don't really necessarily need big organizations so that huge things can happen. And here is some examples how it started. Me and my colleague, I'm a designer and interior architect, worked as an interior architect for 20 years. And my colleague, Pauliina, she is a social scientist and worked for a survey all the time. And we used Facebook like for fun, to connect with the friends and to have knowledge about things happening around us. One night, my colleague Pauliina was wondering that how complicated it is to recycle. Her husband had traveled away for 1 week and she had promised that she will throw all the unnecessary items from their home to the recycling. And by the end of the week, whilst he was on his way back, she realized that she hasn't done anything, alone with 2 kids in the city center without a car. Impossible to recycle in Helsinki. So she got this idea that why we can't just, throw these things on the street and let people to take them. Why can't there be one day that I could go outside of my door on the sidewalk and sell my stuff or give it away? And she went on and on and on about it in Facebook. And suddenly I went to her that, look, make a test. Create a group, open a page, ask people if they are interested. And next morning I woke up, there were 6,200 people on that page. And everybody wanted to do the same. Why can't we have at least one day per year when people could just recycle very agile outside of their homes? 2 months later, we had something that was called Siivouspäivä, the cleaning day. A week later, we realized that one day is not enough. People wanted to do it more often. And since 2012, we've had it twice a year all over Finland. It was supposed to be a small experiment, maybe in downtown Helsinki, but we started this collective process with the people on the Facebook, and suddenly it was all over the Finland. And we couldn't do anything about it. I will tell about the process later, but just to understand what we've done. Second thing was that Helsinki city was asking us that the Helsinki Day, the celebration of Helsinki, like the birthday of Helsinki, is so boring, that is there anything we could do together? That if you have this ability to get people excited. And we went back, we went to the people, in a Facebook, opened a page asking what should we do together to celebrate the birthday. And somebody said, of course, eat together. And we get this funny idea that, okay, let's build as long dinner table as we can imagine. We picked up Esplanade. We decided to close the streets from the cars and build a half-a-kilometer table for 1,000 people to come with their own food, wine, and sit next to the other citizens and eat together. It was a crazy idea, and municipalities were like, oh no, not possible, and it will be a mess and blah, blah, blah. And we didn't really know if people are interested or not. But we did it, and the moment we put the tickets, which were like free, because it was part of the Helsinki Day, in the internet, it took 2 minutes and 7 seconds, and all the tickets were gone. And people were really excited, they really got this idea. Small groups of people coming with their friends, sitting next to other citizens and enjoying the dinner. And the first time was really success. Even it started to rain after the first 20 minutes. People didn't mind. After an hour, it looked like this. Yeah, but they didn't leave. I went around saying that, look, you know, you came at 7 and now it's almost 10 and you should go home, you're all wet. You know, I mean, and people said, no, we are not leaving. We will stay here because this is so nice that we will stay until the end. And we will show the municipalities that we want to do it all the time. We want to do it next year. And it became a tradition. But at the same time, there were so many people who were unhappy because they didn't get the tickets. So we went back to the office and we thought, what shall we do? Why can't anybody do the same? Why can't we have a one day when anybody can bring their table to the sidewalk or nearby park or square or whatever? And again, we went back to the people and say, how about this? And then together with the people, we created an idea of we call it the dinner under Finnish sky everywhere. One day in August when anybody can do the same. They can bring the table on the sidewalk or by the shore or on the streets or on the park. And we created them a platform and negotiated with the municipalities about it. On top of these 2 projects, we have done approximately 10 other smaller projects. And those projects have come and they are gone. We've given them away for the people who were active with the project. And with this process, since 2012, we kind of grew up being the service designers of participation. So soon I quit my job. A little bit later, Pauliina quit her job, and we started a totally new occupation. We didn't even know what we were doing. At the same time, we also opened this crowdfunding platform. And very soon we realized that this change I mentioned in the beginning is really big, because since last 35 years, even more, the main actors of the society have been the market and the government or the state, and always targeting towards the individuals, which are kind of looked as consumers and citizens. And we really realized that if we want, there is also a big transition from consumer culture and consumer way of thinking, that the citizens are the consumers of the city, towards the culture of participation and co-creation. This is funny, some people were on a workshop at Helsinki City Hall, and they had to tell that which were the things that they think have changed Helsinki the most on this century. And they didn't say that this new thing or new building or whatever. They said internet, recession, European Union, activism, this kind of communal places on the residential areas, restaurant day, cleaning day, and Helsinki being the capital of culture 2000. So they have a totally different understanding what changed the cities. So the old days, and also very much today, it's from top to bottom, and everybody is talking that it should be from bottom to top, how we create things. But on our experience, it's more like generally together, that this is how we should do, and really utilize the power of collective creativity. We think that we are all part of something bigger than ourselves. We are not targets, we are not consumers. And we think that this should be the way that the entire society should be run. And the municipalities and other structures, the big organizations, they should be supporting structures for what citizens are doing and supporting functions. This is Heymans and teams, how they kind of describe the old power and the possibilities of the new power, which more or less has started since the digitalization. And maybe most important here for us is that this old power is spreading the word from top to bottom, and in the new power, everything is spreading horizontally, and you can't really control it, what's happening. And things are happening from people to people, and organizations are part of it. Municipalities are part of it, but it's not from organizations to people. And this kind of creativity process, like the cleaning day, they are born spontaneously, what happened to my colleague, without planning, and they can't be commanded. You can't say that, okay, now you have to design something sustainable, what could happen in a city. Or it can't be commanded that come here, be social, participate, be together. It has to come from the people themselves. But when it happens, it can and it should be fed. And this is still on our feeling that, for example, Helsinki doesn't do enough. It's not checking that what's happening there. Helsinki is still checking that what we are doing as a city. Instead of, oh, you are doing an interesting thing, how could we help you to go further and put your project on the next level? So there is a real power of speed and creativity and intensity, a real flow when this kind of things happen. My colleague thinks often that all of us, we are participants, we are developers, we are designers, we are innovators. We are not only citizens. All of us are experts, for example, of our city. Everyone has experience and opinions. And we can't no longer restrict people on the different roles. Like coming to tell me that, Tanya, look, you know, you are an interior architect. Could you please stop of doing this cleaning day or having been the expertise what Helsinki city people should do? Also, the work is changing. There is not like this strict occupations anymore. So same person can be a doctor and a city planner. It doesn't matter who does, but what we do and what has to be done. That is most important. Of course, we need always these early adapters and active people, and we need experts. The further we go in this path, we need even more experts. But what we need to do also is experiment, experiment, experiment. And this is the worst part, uncertain leadership. It's really easy to lead. I've had many people working for me when I was an interior architect. It was really easy. But leading a community, leading a project where you don't know what will happen. As an interior architect, I always had a target. This is my view of this building, and people working with me helped to get this view ready. And I had to learn totally different way of leading and facilitating. And it's really worth it, but it's hard work. About leadership, sorry, a pretty bad picture, but there is no other picture. There is a lady, elderly lady called Sara, living at Kallio about more than 10 years ago. This park in Kallio, Karhupuisto, was full of drunken people, and they were sitting there all around the day and shouting, and it was messy and everything, and people living around, they really didn't like it. And suddenly this elderly lady got an idea that if we make the park really pretty, then maybe they would start to behave. So she kind of collected her friends, and they bought a lot of flower seeds and started to plant the flowers, which city didn't do, and created a beautiful, beautiful garden there and kept it up for many years. And suddenly the park became a very nice park, and these drunk people more or less moved away or started to behave a little bit better. I said you should feed it. The city didn't do anything. Later on, she died, unfortunately, and now if you go there, there is no flowers. They could have carried on, but because it was not officially decided that this is now, you know, that city would take, for example, the ownership of the work she had done and carry the work. This is a good Kallio block party, a very famous block party. Started with a very small group many years ago, and just they wanted to organize a block party, and it grew and grew and grew and grew organically. There's no organization behind it, there is no NGO, there is nothing, there is no financing. And nowadays it's about 30,000 people who participate in the block party. And Helsinki is very proud of it, finally, and it means a lot for the atmosphere of Helsinki. So at Vantaa there is a new residential and office area called Aviopolis. And nowadays when you create these areas, you just don't do the city planning and you just don't build houses, but you also do projects on an area to get people adjusted. And they got this idea that let's have a block party. I mean, new residential area, okay. How they did it? They opened a competition for prize in Hilma, which is this kind of system where it's all, you know, the governmental and public projects, and won this kind of very okay kind of festival organizer won the competition. So they got 50,000 euro to organize a block party. Do you know how many people came to the block party? 5. I mean, why? I mean, you can't, these kind of things, you can't just, like, let's organize a block party, let's put, now you all be social together. It doesn't work like that. It has, these kind of things have to come from the people. And then it would be nice that city would come and support. But I guess Marko will talk about more about these kind of issues and municipalities. But how we do our work? We create interfaces and platforms, like APIs almost. The dinner under the sky and the cleaning day, they are kind of interfaces between municipalities and citizens. We really worked hard with the municipalities to be able to organize these things. For the cleaning day, we didn't get any permit. So we did it like it was illegal. We couldn't stop it anymore because people wanted to do it. It was success, and next year we could carry on with the negotiations with the municipalities. And at the moment they are really proud about this project. But we created a new kind of urban culture and new kind of recycle culture to Helsinki. But we also created services for municipalities and the permit office and the police and rescue department. So we really sat down together with them and thought how we solve this problem. Because normally in Finland, if you want to use the city space for your own purposes, for example to sell something, or to have a performance or theater act or whatever, you have to apply for a permission. So we kind of created this idea that instead of all this like tens of thousands of people applying a permission, we could create this website with a map, and people would have to mark their sales spot on the map, and then it would be like announcing your sales spot instead of applying the permit. And that would kind of cover because the permit thing is written in the law, so we really had to work how they can't say that you don't have to apply the permit because it's written in the law. But they can say the permit process is covered by this process of pinning your thing. We created cooperation with many actors, like recycling actors who were competitors. We got them together to work together with us, and we could create these recycling spots all over the Helsinki. And that is the only time per year that these competitors work together for the behalf of the city. And we also created a new way of thinking. We went to the city saying that, look, we think that if you give people freedom to use the city the way they find it nice, the way they want to use the city area, they will also take responsibility. But you'll see that it's not going to be a trash all over the city after this happening. And that's exactly what happened. So shortly how we work is like, okay, my colleague Pauliina threw up the idea, and next morning it was over 6,000 people on the Facebook page. Nowadays it's about 60,000 people. Approximately 150,000 people in Finland participate in the event every year. We start to talk with people, and they came with all kinds of ideas. Some of the ideas we considered very stupid, and so we had to be very kind of on a new mood. We had to start to facilitate them, but let them to create. And they decided the first date, they decided the name, they decided everything, and they told what they need. And they came up that this is what they need. We need a map, where to pin here is my sales spot and your sales spot, and where to pin. We need it because how otherwise people would find it, the way to your shop and your shop. So it works also as a marketing. And they said we need posters, we need a logo, we need this, and we did everything together. Who could design the poster, who could do that? But still kind of facilitating everything. And then when the cleaning day came, these are the producers, they are the producers, they are the people doing the project. So we are just enabling them. So we are not the producers of this project, but we are the enablers. And for years and years and years, we listened to them and changed it and grew it and do it different way, so that it became a kind of event that everybody thought that this is how it should be. And this is more or less how we work all the time. My colleague Pauliina, she gets like great ideas every second week, honestly. I wrote at our office that if you have an idea, exit, because it's too much. And she throws the ideas on the Facebook and tests them. And 90% of them don't get any response. But when it gets response, then you need the people who would, you know, kind of hold it up and bring it further. But you can't do it like let's design a block party. And then we have also a platform called Nappinaapuri, a nifty neighbor. That's a kind of new kind of social media for neighborhoods. And we just launched a few months ago the final version of the platform, and there are about 20,000 people in Helsinki using it. And then we have the platform of crowdfunding. And these we think that they are more or less in kind of APIs, interfaces between people to people. You can use it for getting peer-to-peer funding from other citizens. You can use Nappinaapuri, Nifty Neighbor, to connect your neighbors. And we've let both of them really open, that you can do anything you like there. There are not many rules, like what to do. And for example, this is the Nappinaapuri, and there are some kind of categories, different colors, a little bit guiding people that what you can do there. So we have a category of friendship or neighborhood help and pets and all these kind of issues, so people are able to filter. But suddenly people started to ask that, is it okay also look for friends here? And we said, of course. Or let's ask people. And we asked people, like, what do you think? That many people would like to look for friends here. That are you afraid it's going to be some kind of dating platform or whatever? And over 3,000 people answered immediately, yes, it's okay. And 2 hours we had a new category, friendship. And then comes somebody and said, is it okay to look for grandmas here? We said, okay, of course. And we created a new category, which is like extra grandparents. Because many people in Finland, they live far away from their grandparents, and they need somebody in their everyday life. So this is how we develop the platform. But not that we listen every idea. Is it okay to sell chocolate here? Of course, yeah. But and this is the crowdfunding platform, and this is like, for example, our village movie theater. People organize together, they have an idea, let's build a movie theater in our village, and they put up the campaign, and we don't have to do anything, just support them and market them and facilitate them. Here is a similar communal project, one park, a statue park, people wanted to save together. But we went a bit further from this. What we have launched now is something with the match funding. So it's not only from people to people, but now we want to bring companies and municipalities, cities into it, and start to do the match funding, so that we can have a bigger projects where company money, private money, and government money or cities money is mixed together. The first city we have cooperate with is Tampere. At the moment they have just private money to private money, but beginning of next year they will mix, match the kind of the money, the budget of the city together with these things. And then there can also be cities building the interfaces between the city and the citizens. And this is what happened with Rantakesä. It's like a beach summer project. We created together with Helsinki municipalities the idea of free zones. They came to me asking that, you know, how could we get Helsinki people to use the seashore more? That we have 130 kilometers of seashore in Helsinki, and 95% of that area is free to enter to everybody, which is really unique. If you go to Italy, it would be private, beach club, whatever, but the city had the feeling, or the city planning office, that people are not utilizing it yet enough. And there is a lot of city planning projects going on, and they want people to use it, and they want to have the quiet information from people and follow how people act. And I said, this is really easy. Let's make spots all over the shore and call them a permit-free zone. So we created this idea that every summer there are 14 spots that you can go, or you can go, and said, look, I'm going to have a party here, I'm going to organize a theater project here, I'm going to have a dance here, or I will have a circus here, and you don't have to apply to any permission. But you have to make sure that you don't sell tickets, it's free for everybody, and people understand the rules of these free zones, that there is no official organizer, there is nobody who took the insurance, there is nobody cleaning after you, so you really have to make people to understand. And we made a test, we did it for 3 summers, we did it for the city. And now, this summer, Helsinki City took it part of their working, so we are not facilitating the page anymore. We just built the whole idea and negotiated with different authorities about it, and then now it's part of the Helsinki City, and they will grow it bigger next year. And at the moment, actually, they are planning that all the small events in Helsinki might be done the same way. So you don't have to apply the permit, you just again enter the web page, agree the terms and pin your project there so that it's public, and that's enough. Thank you. That is our story.
Thank you so much, Tanja. And now for the third perspective in design, Marko Steinberg, CEO, founder of Snow Cone Haystack. The floor is
Great.
yours.
Thanks. Give me 2 seconds. And I'll plug in. Was there a... Oh.
Siis ei laiteta olemaan anasti.
Anasti, okei. Kiva. Kiitos. I assume this is on. Yeah, does that look good?
Yeah.
Okay. Great. So, great to be here. And maybe just a couple words of background. I'll try to be a bit brief so we all have a bit of a chance of also pulling together these 3 presentations. There, you didn't need to look at my desktop, but good. So I'm an architect by training. I'm a Finn. I grew up in Italy and then decided to go to the US, studied there, and eventually was a professor at Harvard at the design school for 10 years. I came back to Finland and worked for the government for 5 years for an organization called the Finnish Innovation Fund, and established design as a strategic capacity at the fund. And then in 2013 set up my own practice, Snow Cone and Haystack. And my passion and focus is helping governments transform and leaders innovate. So basically my interest the last 20 plus years, 25 years has been to bring design to government. And I realized when I was at Harvard that most of the big issues that governments are challenged with are fundamentally design challenges. And yet there was no design capacity. And as I think both speakers did a great job at kind of building the background for this, illustrated, it also challenges what we mean by design and how we teach designers. So I'll try to run quickly through it. My concern has been these years that the way we conceive of government is not aligned with the current nature of the world we live in. And I actually am very concerned that governments may not be viable in the future anymore if they don't quite radically change what government means and how government works and how government delivers. I think, without getting into this too much, a lot of what you see with Trump, with the rise of populism, is not that people are necessarily as radical as they seem to be, but is more an anti-establishment reaction. It's a recognition that the way we've governed our society doesn't work anymore. And until we have a better proposition, there will be, I believe, increasing anti-establishment sentiment, which gets hijacked by the likes of the Brexits and of the Trumps of the world. And the crux of the problem is that we have 18th century organizations trying to deal with 21st century issues. Our concept of government, our concept of what good governance is, what is responsible government, comes from 18th century concepts. And then we're very applicable and very effective. And we're beginning to see that they're actually failing us on the most critical jobs. So let me take a little detour, because I'm trying to make a bit of a design pitch. I usually don't talk about design. Let me put some very broad and vague placeholders out there about design. I'm going to show you a series of numbers here. These are dates. 2018, I believe, is the year we're living right now. And you can ask yourself, well, why is society the way that it is today? Why do we think this way? Why do organizations work the way they do? Why is government built the way? Why do we have the opportunities and the problems that we have today? Well, a lot of people might go, and this is a pretty gross way of looking at this. Well, actually, one of the big sort of markers in history was the Industrial Revolution. there was a radically different way of doing things that transformed in very fundamental ways how societies are organized. Right? Now, I've always been skeptical of the term industrial revolution because the idea of revolution suggests that it suddenly happened. It didn't happen suddenly. There were many things that happened that led to this transformation. So then the question is, how did we suddenly have this revolution in the way that we organize society, in the way that we produce things? You can go back here and we have what we might call the scientific revolution. For the first time, we had the blossoming of sciences, something that we didn't really quite have. We began to understand biology, chemistry. We began to understand the environment. We had physics and principles of physics that then allowed us to build the engines and machinery and organizations that were able to produce in industrial quantities and in industrial manners. Without the scientific revolution, we would not have the industrial revolution. So that was necessary. Then you can ask yourself, well, why did we have the scientific revolution? Did it just suddenly, people woke up one day and said, ooh, let's think differently? No. And I'd go actually quite specifically to this date here. And this was the date a mathematician published a book that in a way popularized a transformation that was already happening, but flipped the scale of it. And that is, in the West, the shift from Roman numerals to Arabic numerals. Okay, so the number system we have now is based on Arabic numeral system, not the Roman. So think about before this, most math was done through Roman numerals. So when I taught one of my courses at Harvard, the first assignment I gave my students, which I'll give to you, is could you please divide these two numbers? That by that. I will tell you it is impossible, and all of you who are trying to figure out what it is you're cheating because you're changing these numbers to Arabic-based numeral system, then you're doing the division, and then you're trying to translate it back to Roman numerals. The long story short is that you can't manage complex mathematics with Roman numerals. You can do very simple additions, subtractions, additions. That's about it. Okay? So a lot of the scientific, physical phenomena that we live in, like why are the stars moving the way they are, could not be explained through math. And hence, we couldn't have the science behind it. And hence, a lot of our beliefs had to rely on the notion of divine intervention. Well, the stars are there just because God willed it, because we didn't have the modes of representation to deal with that complexity. Right? Can you imagine the moment we could do complex mathematics? We could actually predict where the star is going to be moving in the sky. Right? So the first time we had a way of managing complexity in a way that we couldn't. And that put us on a completely different path of transformation, in a way the society understood not just how the environment works, but how we can impact and change how the environment works. And that's the path that we've been on. And I think everything we have, the logics of governments and institutions and of good organization and good governance, are really very much rooted in the science way of doing things. All right? Now, so that's one point I want to mention, and I would say this leads me to the notion that we are, I believe, at another quite important transformation, where I think visualization is allowing us to manage complexity in a way that we hadn't managed before, ever before. This almost to the scale that numbers allowed us to make a transformation. You've probably noticed, if you follow the New York Times or the Helsinki Sanomat, that in the last probably 15 years, there's been more and more visual tools and aids that media is using to explain statistics and other things. Because we're beginning to realize that visualizing numbers actually make them more understandable. And when people like you and I, who may be professionals in this field, can go much deeper with that, we begin to understand that there is a whole new level in which complexity can be managed. I see a lot of government leaders, a lot of ministers, a lot of permanent secretaries of state that have to make very complex decisions, like our healthcare reform decision. And on their desks are piles and piles and piles of text-based reports. Each one is well understood, but the combined effect of that is really impossible to understand. So let me illustrate this in a very, very simple way. Some of you may know the term Menard. He was a person who did this map. This is the map of Napoleon's march to Russia, the war against Russia. And it's a very interesting map because it puts geography, it's got geographic features, right? Moscow's over here. You've got rivers, right? So it's a map. Overlaid on the map are arrows. The beige is the amount of French soldiers going to Russia. In black are the amount of French soldiers retreating from the failed Russian campaign. So already here, this is how many soldiers went. This is how many soldiers came back alive. I mean, that is staggering. You can at a glance already understand, in a way, the human tragedy of this concept. And what's important then is you can see at certain moments that a unit of an army unit diverged to probably fight a side battle over here, and then retreated and rejoined the retreating forces from over there. You can also see, if you follow rivers, had a huge impact on the course of the battle. You have this many soldiers on this side of the river, and only half of them made it across the river. So you begin to see the interconnection between geographic features, the timeline, and the amount of soldiers, and down here is the temperature, because we knew a very cold winter had a huge impact on this. There's many layers of information put here, and we can, at a very quick glance, get a sense of the big picture. What is essential? How is it coming together? How does it synthesize? Right? This is what we're missing. Decision makers, stakeholders have all these reports. They understand each little bit of this, but they can't see the big picture. And therefore will make decisions that are well-intentioned, but they're completely unaware of the unintended consequences of those well-intended decisions, because they don't see how things are connected. So I think this new world where we're getting in, where we have data, we have visualization, we have the ability to connect things in very complex ways, the ability to zoom in and out of details, see the bigger picture, is allowing us to understand things in a very different way. All right, let me jump back for about maybe 15 minutes to my rant around government and transformation. So for me, this frequently starts with a very simple question I ask, which may sound a bit abstract, so forgive me, is I ask leaders, what do you really believe in? Do you believe the world is predictable or ambiguous? Predictable would suggest the idea that if we study as scientists this thing enough, the data will tell us what to do. Right? Ambiguous suggests that you can study the problem as much as you want, but the issues keep changing. And even if you can nail it down for a moment, you and I will have very different ideas about what the issue is. And a lot of times, our perspective on the issues may actually be in conflict with each other. There is no way to have an absolute sense of what the facts are. The facts won't tell you what the solution is. There are facts that are important, but it can't be fact-driven. Right? Our systems of governance are fundamentally based on the notion that the world at some level is predictable. That's why governments love to do lots of studies, and if they haven't done enough studies, they'll do more studies. And if we just study the healthcare system a little more, I know it's really complicated, bear with me, we're going to do one more study and then we'll get the answers. And then finally, we'll have the solution. No, it just doesn't work. And if you've created an organization and a way of working that's based on this notion, and yet you're dealing with questions that are very ambiguous, like climate change, conflict, many of big issues, you are fundamentally going to fail. You're applying the wrong tool to the wrong class of problems. And this is, I think, our big challenge in society. We have fundamentally ambiguous issues that we're trying to deal with, and we're trying to approach them with logics of predictability. The simpler way to say this is, are we looking for known solutions or new solutions? I'm oversimplifying here. There's the assumption that we'll look at how the world is organized now, and if we study enough, there will be a solution that already exists that's good for us. We're basically just looking for existing solutions. We may want to tweak it a little bit and so on. No, we're actually looking for pretty radically new kinds of solutions. I believe there is no known solution to climate change. So I don't think we should be looking around in the hopes that somehow, somewhere, the solution will exist. We have to create something that doesn't exist. And we can, in a way, pin this around the notion that this 18th century way of working is fundamentally a question of logic. It's the wrong logic. I know I'm repeating myself, but I just want to drive this home. So I'll pick up where Tanya left with what happens when citizens organize themselves. So another, around this period that you were just in a way exposed to, was this beautiful little thing. For those of you who live in Helsinki, you know this was in Kamppi. And one day, this little van appeared, and the camionette did crepes, French pancakes, right? Hugely popular, it was fantastic. It was probably one of the first street food occurrences in Helsinki. You have to understand, especially I do a lot of work in Asia, and people just don't understand. They're like, what do you mean you don't have street food? Yeah, we don't have street food until very recently, okay? Everything was highly regulated, all right? So this was a new thing. And it turns out this was completely illegal. And the reason why this was completely illegal is that the city couldn't figure out whether this was a car or a restaurant. And so it couldn't figure out who's going to license it, right? So here we are as governments. We've organized our own logics, and then we ask ourselves, does the world fit our logic? And if the world doesn't fit our logic, then it must be illegal. And what we need to do is shift that. We need to say, what's the logic by which the world works? And how do we realign ourselves to support that? Right? That's easier said than done. But that's the transformation we had to do. And my conclusion to this would say that the current system of government is not aligned with its purpose. All right. Take a little detour, but I think it's important to realize why in Finland the concept of government is not aligned with its purpose. All right. We're up here. Some people would say we're kind of on the edge of the world. We move up a little north, we'll fall off the edge. This, I think, was our mental concept for a very long time. This is a complete detour, but some people in my family still talk about going to Europe. I don't know what that's about, but anyhow. All right, so this concept of good governance, what a good city is, wasn't born overnight again. It's not like the Industrial Revolution or the science. These aren't revolutions. They mature over time and over experiences, and you forge a culture through those experiences. So this good culture that said that street food was illegal came because government was built for a very different purpose. And it was for the sole purpose, I'm oversimplifying here, but just to make the point clear, the purpose of government was to help in a very simple but complex transformation from farms to cities, from an agricultural society to an industrial society. And this is the, sorry, I don't have any, you can see I'm not a scientist. But anyhow, this is the, basically the income of people with purchasing power in 1900. So if you, 1 days of work, I don't know, bought you an apple here, then in 2000 it bought you 14 apples. So you can see the kind of explosive nature, the growth, the success of Finland in a certain way, right? The same amount of work allowed you to enter into a much wealthier world. This is amazing. I mean, when we talk about the Industrial Revolution, it's a bit of a kind of pick and choose date in a certain way because different countries evolve at different rates. And Finland was actually very late at industrializing. So 1900 to now. And I think what we forget, and I'm sorry I tell this story the same way, but that it wasn't, but I would argue 5 minutes ago that this was Finland. This is what I would historically coin our sticks, stones, and squirrels era. That was Finland. And 4 minutes ago, this was Finland. This was average life in Finland, right? We were a low-income country. This is not a long time ago. The kind of mean way of making an earning was an agricultural based. In this case here, families, kids in the field burning wood to make tar industry. Right? What do you think their life expectancy is? What do you think the economy looks like? What do you think any of the metrics of good society look like? Right? This is a low income country. And this is not far away. This is my grandparents' childhood. We have forgotten how quickly this country has transformed from farm to cities and how successful government was in that transformation. And because it was so successful, success breeds contempt. We want to believe that this magic of government that has helped us in this amazing transformation is still with us. And government was then built to take these kids and give them a better future, build a more resilient society, a more prosperous society. And it did it through many things, amongst other things, schools. We built a school system school system that was very effective in training kids to be productive members of an industrialized workforce. It was also, which is the side part of this, an effective place to park the kids while mom and dad went to the factory. Right? So you have to think about both sides of it. If you have an industrial society and the parents are working in the factory and you don't want them to be in the factory, but you want to improve societies, then school is also a parking ground for the kids. I will mention, I always have to mention, doesn't everybody look the same? I mean, it's kind of scary. So when we talk about the Nordic success, I think we need to be both proud of it, and then we have to also be a bit skeptical and critical of it, because it's very easy to lead large-scale social transformations when everybody comes from the same gene pool, and everybody has the same idea, and everybody has shared values. And it is a much more ambiguous task to do it when we have different belief systems, and we have different experiences and different cultures. Right? So we need to find a new model to do that work, that this was so successful. And we can't assume what worked well yesterday is going to work well in the future. Now, it wasn't just about schools. It was deeply ideological. We also thought about how do we want to build our cities. This is Tapiola. In English, we refer to this as the Garden City. You have to understand that globally, this rush to urbanization was driven by a simple concept of cities as high density, and I would say highly industrial and mechanical concept of a city. And for us, we had a different ideology for this. We wanted to connect two different things. One, the need for greater density, and the other one is our close cultural connection to nature. So how do you do that? And in fact, if you're bringing a lot of people from farms to cities, you're going to probably acclimate them culturally much better in an environment that has traits of agriculture and nature in it than a completely foreign kind of environment. And so we built these things. We built things with giant pools of water and lots of nature and low, medium density. This is by no means the most cost-effective way of building. But this is probably the most socially resilient way of building in this context. And this is what kind of irks me about a lot of the transformation conversations we're having today. It's purely driven, seems to me, by the cost efficiency aspect of it without actually understanding the greater dimensions of this. This was by no means. More effective would be not to have water and just fill this up with as many buildings. Because when you build a building this high, to do it twice as high, it really doesn't cost any more. Right? So you do lots of high density with none of these nature features in it. All right, but we didn't just build the systems of sanitation in schools and so on, or our concepts of cities, we also built our political systems. And so what do you have? You have basically a three-party system to some degree. You have a party that is the farmers' party, because you're going from farms to cities. You have a party that represents the industry workers, because farmers are going to be moving over. And you have a party that represents the owners of business, because that's the sort of big transformation that's going on. I would argue we still have those same party logics at play, and yet everyone's in the city. We have a completely different kind of transformation. So you find parties that were built out of a certain era with a certain ideology struggling to actually understand how they fit in this new transformation we're going. Of course, not only don't they look happy because they're from Finland, but because this is the farmers' party, right? Realizing that there is this earth-shattering transformation happening. But government and the concept of government was hugely successful in creating this transformation. And imagine the people we have in government now, the leaders of our government, were born in here. And they were the sons and daughters of this success. And they were born into believing that this way of working will only lead to better and better futures. And yet we are right here at a kind of cultural delta between the reality of how the numbers are looking and the belief that if we just continue this way, eventually things will get better. We saw that after the subprime collapse in 2007 and 8, that there was somehow a hidden belief that, well, the economy will pick up again, as if there's a return to some sort of normal. I just want to put this in perspective quickly. This is the chief economist, Bank of England. Since 1750, so the Industrial Revolution, it has taken around 50 years for living standards to double. Before that, it would have taken 6,000 years. I mean, think about that, you know? So I always think of myself as a loop in a long family chain. There's my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, and so on, and so on, and so on, and so on. there was 6,000 years of my family waiting around and nothing was getting any better. And then in one generation, living standards doubled. I mean, that's amazing. That's how you move societies. That's where you finally think you found the solution to how you build prosperous countries and so on. And that's why I think it's so difficult to realize that what worked so well in Finland in the past may not actually work well in the future. And I think we have a complete breakdown of our governance concepts. Because Finland is this. This is, if we look at people with immigrant backgrounds and their percentage of the population, we see that there are in a couple municipalities. There is, the reality in a city like Helsinki is completely different from a place which has seen 0 new DNA. Right? So can we have a shared concept of, is this everybody with the same ideas shaping a society, or people with many voices and finding a new concept? If we look at some of these things, these are some of the immigration issues, right? So the densities. These are retired, so how much of the population is retired? So we have pockets here, for example, where over 50% of the population is retired, not working. And then this is how many people in the capable workforce is employed. And so here we have less than 33.9% of the population. So look at that region. I don't want to pick anybody, but there's basically 0 new DNA. Most people are retired. And of the few people who are remaining, most of them are unemployed. The dynamic there is absolutely different from Helsinki, where there's a healthy mix of different kinds of people. Very young population, very few retired people. And most people are working. Can we even speak of a Finland? These communities have more in common with other places in Europe than they do with this reality here. Right? And we can't govern Finland the same way. All right. What we're doing is, in this 18th century model that's proved so successful, and the track record proves it, is that we're trying to apply yesterday's answers to today's questions. And we keep doing it more and more forcefully, thinking that it will lead to new things. If we look at how the population is aging, it's radical. This is not just a bubble that's about to happen. So the issues that we have in some remote populations, if we can find new ways of governing and providing solutions, it's not just about Kainuu or some small municipality. It's actually a global issue. And if you could reinvent what governance means in that context, you're actually helping solve a global issue. You could create growth. Those small municipalities could be leaders when China, in about 5 minutes, is going to explode because the parent-to-child dependency is unsustainable in terms of the aging population. The conventional concept of retirement and social care will not work in China. So how do you maintain social stability in that context? You need the small municipalities of Finland to be highly innovative, provide alternative solutions, and help build the know-how for that. So these are growth opportunities, but we're not addressing these issues the way that they should be. If we look at climate change, this is just table water in the US and a dramatic shift in it. We're basically seeing that most of the agricultural areas of the US in very few years are basically going to completely disappear. We don't have water anymore. So our food agricultural systems are about to change in very fundamental ways. And as we did at the fund, if you want to do zero carbon cities, you can't just think of the building. You need to think about changing energy policy, food production, transportation, and building codes. It's a systems-wide intervention into the marketplace. For me, it's a design problem. This is what we did when we delivered this city block, is not only the building's really a vehicle to change the environment. We activated citizens to realize that there's a new need out there. We created new investment partnerships, new legal documents, new frameworks. There's no legal framework for mixed use in Finland, which is a bit odd. So we were able to do some of those. Change fire regulations, you can use wood in large structures and so on and so on. Whether it's climate change and carbon neutrality in cities, or education, or healthcare, no one owns the strategic question. Each ministry or department owns a bit of it. There is no professional capacity to design at the systems level. So we're missing the institutions and the professional capacity. I think the professional capacity could come from this kind of group if tooled appropriately. All right, give me 3 more minutes and or 4 more minutes and I'll sort of end. So government is not dumb. They realize that, yes, we've had a lot of successes. Past solutions are great, but they're not going to carry us in the future. So how do we answer this question of new solutions or known solutions? So there's a lot of conversation about experimental Finland. The ministry, prime minister has opened up a bunch of activities and so on and so on. There's also a lot of frustration. Just a couple of days ago, there was a report that came out that, this is, sorry, my kind of loose translation. It was a research document that said municipalities are really tired of all these experiments because these experiments never lead to any change, right? And there's fatigue in the field. And I understand completely the fatigue. Municipalities with diminishing resources and increasing issues that they have to deal with are asked to do not just keep schools open and run business as usual, but then on the side to think about how to transform it. And you can't do both at the same time. It's very difficult. You need to resource the new. And I like this John F. Kennedy word, is efforts and courage are not enough without purpose and direction. So for me in Finland, most experiments are actually designed to fail because they have no purpose and direction. They're like, let's do something with kids and let's see. Okay, great. Then something happens and then no one has any idea of what to do next. And then you wait another year and the thing fizzles. So most experiments in Finland are designed to fail, and I'm very concerned about this experimental conversation because it gives license to the idea that Finland is very innovative and we're doing something about government. And so it puts to rest the concerns people have. And I think when people actually realize what's under the hood, it's not some fantastic engine, but there's actually nothing, it will be a bit too late. So the first problem is we never ask ourselves when we're doing experiments, what if the experiment succeeds? What would you do? Okay, we're going to do the school thing, but what are you going to do next? And prepare for it. No business in its right mind would say we're going to launch a new product, and then we'll just see what happens. And then, oh my God, Apple gets all confused because 1 million people wants their product. Oh, we didn't know people we don't have a plan for how we're going to deliver 1 million. Of course, there's the plan for the next thing, and you launch into it, and there are gates and ways of managing those risks. So no one answers this question, and there's no preparation on this end. Good governance. Like, what's a good way of leading? What's responsible way of leading? And I think this is asymmetrically driven because the risk of doing new things is seen as very big, and there is very little conversation about the risk of not doing things. And I think as designers, we love to talk about doing new things, but we got to get much, much, much better about articulating what not doing means. And right now, in the city of Helsinki, for social services, if we don't radically change how they're delivered, we will have a completely unmanageable system. There aren't monies, there aren't staffings, and there isn't the know-how to do it. Those risks far outweigh the risks of doing an experiment. When in 1969 we sent Apollo mission to the moon for the very first time, this was something no one had ever done before. You could not ask yourself what the risk of going to the moon was. If you look at the funding for NASA, which was created in the 50s for this specific purpose, for the space competition, spending that Congress approved ended up being, the actual spending was 5 times more than Congress approved. Not because people lied about how much it would cost to go to the moon. There was no way to benchmark it. It was something completely new. You can't study going to the moon if you've never done it before and get an accurate estimate on it. But what's interesting is the more we go to the moon, the more it normalizes, right? So we need to make a distinction when we fund things between funding things that are quite normative and funding things that are dealing with a completely new kind of solution. And what we do over and over and over in government is, let's do this stuff, but let's apply that logic. When I worked for the Finnish Innovation Fund, all the time we wanted to do new and experimental things that had never been done before, like zero carbon cities. But we want the exact budget, the exact timeline, the exact deliverable, and if you're late on any of those, we'll hold you accountable. Well, now you're applying a logic of predictability on a challenge of ambiguity, uncertainty. And then I think what's very clear in these experiments is frequently what is the ultimate objective. When we went with the city of Lahti to change their citizen engagement around city planning, it was to get them to understand that engagement needs to be at the core of all service innovations. But we couldn't do that at the broad level. We had to enter in a very specific way. After this process, the city declared that all service development has to involve some component of citizen engagement. We could not have done that without the practicalities of reworking their city planning process. So there's a broader objective. And I think there is no conversation about what is the architecture of the solution, that big bubble thing. How is policy connected to energy, connected to how people behave, connected to your solution, et cetera, et cetera. And the difficult and really hard thing for all of us to understand is that a lot of good ideas don't add up to a great idea. You don't change systems by coming up with 10 of the best ideas. It just doesn't work. Actually, the 10 best ideas will end up creating a worse solution. Right? So it's like a recipe. You don't make the best cake by putting the most eggs, the most flours, the most sugar, or the best. Right? You have to understand what is the relationship and the sequencing of these things so you create positive sum. And I think designers are quite well poised to do that. So I'll just leave it in kind of broad way. I think design brings the capacity to visualize and manage complexity of a higher order. I think we have an iterative way of working that engages both the proposition and the possible solution, that manages risks in a way that is well aligned with uncertain issues where you don't know what will and won't work. Right? And there are many other aspects like the ability to understand what is the architecture of a solution. How does this app thing work with our overall service thing, with how buses work, with how that goes, that bigger problem. But I think we need to also transform quite radically how we teach and skill this profession. Thanks.
If I may ask, Idil and Tanya, for a brief Q&A.
Sure. If I may ask for 2 minutes of a break.
Yes.
This one's back.
What's up? Hello, hello. Hi, Dite, can you hear me? Yo, Dite.
This is for us. Yeah,
Good.
for us.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's probably
Yeah, just switching mics now. All right. So now it's the question time. Yeah. Oh, whoa, whoa, whoa. So there's mic.
Okay. Thank you. So yeah, thank you very much. It's been all very interesting. I have one question for Idil. You showed us this design transition slide, the process slide. I was wondering if you could give us one case study of a concrete example of one socio-technical system that would be transformed.
Sure. Well, so at the moment, a lot of transition projects are going on, particularly in the energy system. in the EU, including Finland, because energy is of course very relevant to climate change. And so there are many consortiums in different countries doing transition projects in energy. Also there are projects on mobility as well. So does this answer your question?
Would you say they follow the process that you showed us earlier in the presentation, and how does that work out in practice?
Well, the slide that I showed was a simplification of how practice transition projects are undertaken. So it starts with it's generally referred to as transition arena. So you bring, you create an arena for bringing people together to start having conversations about how the system can change or what the system should be like. And then you work with policymakers, and in more ideal cases you also work with bottom-up actors, which we call niche actors, and kind of try to understand first of all the dynamics between policy, the mainstream, business and science, and then the niche actors who may be either developing new technologies or demonstrating new social practices that might assist with transitioning, or that might influence how things are done in the mainstream. So it's not a linear process, but what I have shown was a kind of good representation. It's a model, which is always a simplification of reality, but that's how things work in practice. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
But transition projects are long-term projects. So, for example, very recently, Finland, one of my colleagues has been doing work with the energy system. And they have done exactly the same. They brought together relevant stakeholders and developed, visions, and then they developed pathways. That was over a year, but that's not when the project finishes. That's when the kind of, a part of the project finishes, and then you need to actually start to implement, and you need to do a lot of different things at different layers at the same time. Policy making is one thing. Creating incentives for, niche actors, which might be entrepreneurs or social groups, is another thing. So, yeah, does this answer your question?
Yep.
Okay,
thank
cool.
you. Then, if I may have also one question for Marco. What do you think about one particular aspect of the new solutions that are required? Because that was still a bit obscure, what those solutions could actually be. So I was wondering, because of the Apple example you gave us, I think in many instances there's sort of a call for entrepreneurial thinking in all sorts of domains of society where entrepreneurial thinking hasn't been the norm yet. But at the same time, especially in social science and arts, there's this sort of, let's call it a despise of market systems, of competition, of capitalism as a social phenomenon. So my question would be, how would you realign this paradox, and in terms of the new solution, how market-driven should they be, and how much should they embrace competition?
Okay, I'll try to do my best. It's an interesting topic, but it's quite complex. Maybe a quick just follow-up on what was just discussed. I mentioned very quickly in passing a project we led when I was in government called Low to Know, so LOW2NO.org. You may want to look it up. And the idea there was to transform the current market logic, which is very carbon dependent of how we develop cities, to a carbon neutral way. So it's about transforming the marketplace and how you design an intervention to change the marketplace. All right? That was a process that has taken about 10 years. The building is now ready, and the building has helped change fire regulations in Finland. So now you can build large-scale wood structures anywhere in Finland, which has a very systemic effect, not just on carbon footprint in Finland, but also for the wood industry. It's created new legal frameworks in which different condominiums can share things, so that there hasn't be multiple energy systems or other things. So there is a kind of ripple effect that brings. Then to understand what is the actual effects of that would probably take another 10 years of studies and so on and so on. But that's just a kind of concrete example. I would say the difficulty is when you build these partnerships, which are quite complex, that the rhetoric, what people say, can be quite disconnected from what people are actually willing to commit. And I think where we failed significantly was at the last moments of this big initiative. The initiative really tested people's core beliefs. That's why I start the presentation with questions. Do you believe the world is predictable or ambiguous? And when certain members of certain organizations had to sign off on checks that were 50, 100 million euros, they resorted back to old beliefs. They weren't brave enough to take that step forward. And that's where the project, in a way, failed to many degrees. All right, to get to your question, which had many things, I will just maybe point to a couple of things you mentioned. One is I have an architecture background, and part of that was actually going through an art degree, and then a design degree, and then an architecture degree. And I realized only much, much later that this academic path had in it a culture that was very positive, but had some hidden features to it. And one was the kind of unspoken notion that art is good and business is bad. And I just think it's very unconstructive. And I've, in a way, through my own work the last decades, had to undo this. Right? So there's good business and there's bad business. Believe me, there's good art and there's certainly bad art. So this notion that one thing is good and another one is bad is something that I think we really need to break away. I think it has roots because of certain historical moments and reactions to things, but it's not a constructive way to build a culture within a profession. So I think you need to think about that. And for me, it means that we can't expect others to do that. We need to do the work ourselves. So if you're involved from a design community perspective, you need to understand that the more you understand the logics of economies and businesses, the more you're in a position of strength in changing those logics, right? So what I needed to do was actually get really interested in those issues. And they're quite fascinating. And they are real design issues. Right? So there was a question, and I'll just leave it at that, if you don't mind. There was a question I was just given by somebody sort of online. What's the one takeaway of doing design work in government? And so I'll underscore something I try to bring up in the presentation, which is this notion that the logic of government, the fundamental way people think, is through risk. And the issues we're dealing with increasingly are questions of uncertainty. The risk-uncertainty distinction, I think, needs to be made. Risk is about probabilities, and uncertainty is the lack of probabilities. So we have the risk profile of crossing Aleksanterikatu because we know for every 100,000 pedestrians, there's X amount of accidents because we have the data. So we can have a very informed conversation about risk and what is a solution that's appropriate for crossing the street in Helsinki. 1969, when we went to the moon, no one had ever done that before. There were actually nearly zero probabilities of whether a mission like this would succeed or fail. And therefore, the terms of the conversation have to be completely different. Completely different. And it's about uncertainty. You can't look at it through the lens of probabilities. The second time you go, the third time, the fourth time to the moon, you're getting more and more robust probabilities. Then it begins to be more and more of a normalized situation and more predictable. And hence the funding is much more stable. And it's much more of a conversation about risk. Now, all of the bigger things that are vexing both business organizations and governments are increasingly about things about uncertainty. How will society react? How will climate change unfold? How do we address climate change, et cetera, et cetera? So I think the biggest takeaway is A, to recognize that, and then B, to be very active to change the terms of any conversation you're having in government to be the right ones. Because otherwise you're going to be hitting your head on the wall. Others will dictate what is success for the project based on predictability when actually it's not. So I think you always have to ask yourself, fine, but are you dealing with a question that is actually uncertain? Do you actually have the statistics around it? And then they'll say, yes, we do. But then you say, do you have the statistics about this issue given the context has changed? Like we have statistics around school systems in Finland, But if you take that same model and put it in Bangladesh, no one has statistics about what a Finnish model looks like in a Bangladeshi context. Or what does a Finnish model look like when Finland or Helsinki becomes much more diverse as a population, or when the economy change. Actually, we are looking at old statistics that are born out of a very different context. So I always kept raising this doubt in leaders' minds that we're looking at statistics that are actually maybe less relevant than they think. And the nature of the problem is different. So that's my biggest takeaway, is to recognize there's a different conversation around uncertainty than around risk.
Sorry. Yeah, so my question is mainly for Idil and Marco. So today we use a lot of metrics or a lot of indices that we use to define our research. Do you think many of them are still valid today, or they're just being used because that's the standardized method? For example, a Human Development Index, are those still valid with the because they were developed maybe 20 years ago, but can they still be valuable in the 21st century, for example?
Well, the answer to that is not a yes or no. I think indexes have their place in informing debates and informing research, but indexes are generally they generally simplifies a complex problem, isolates one aspect of it, and then creates some measurements. So for that reason, I personally don't use indexes in my work. But I introduce different indexes to my students. You may use some of the more relevant indexes, and there are also newer indexes as well. For example, one good example of this is there has been a lot of discussion on GDP not being a good measurement for economic well-being, and it was not actually conceived to be an indicator by its conceiver either, but for some reason, it started in US, they adopted as an indicator. So in sustainability, there's a lot of conversation about the economic model and shortcomings of it, and how it is, how scarcity can only be observed in the market, whereas of course a tree might have a lot of value actually for the society, as well as intrinsic value, whether it enters into the market and then it of course becomes a commodity. So there are so people have started to develop, okay, how can we actually measure well-being instead of, for example, monetary exchanges in a better way. So there are indexes that are complex indexes. One of them is from New Economics Foundation in UK that looks at the same time, that combines GDP with ecological debt. Or there are happiness indexes, subjective happiness indexes. So there are, and the work is ongoing in relation to creating indexes. So there's no, yes or no answer to that. My answer would be some indexes are still very useful, and there are emerging indexes that might actually be useful in our research. But doing research relying on one way of measuring one thing is a bad idea if you're particularly interested in complex issues.
Let me just add a little bit. So I agree, and it's a complex issue because we may be talking about apples and oranges. So if I have a very specific question that is very sort of bound, I don't know, what shoes are slippery, what shoes are not slippery, then the data will tell me that, and it's a pretty straightforward kind of thing. So I think the more we get into kind of indices and complex issues, the more factors that contribute to it that actually we don't understand. At the end of the day, my answer would be that numbers don't make decisions, people make decisions. And I think we forget that too frequently. We have this belief that if the numbers will tell us what to do. So we need to look at it, and the more complex the issue is, the more I think channels and voices we need to have at the point of decision making. For me, a lot of these indices are actually quite absurd too. Most livable city, Copenhagen, actually turns out it's becoming one of the least livable cities because the cost of living is unaffordable. The happiest people, come on, please. We have some of the highest medication rates for depression in the world. We have suicide rates. So clearly there are strong biases built into these indices. I think where the indices are good is that they can help generate a conversation that hasn't happened. It legitimizes a conversation about happiness. It legitimizes a conversation about livability. Where it becomes very dangerous, and this is where you can't outsource the issue, is if people just go with the index and try to meet its criteria. Where it becomes very healthy is to say, that's great, these are global issues, how would we think about it? How do we have an informed conversation that sustains our decision making in here?
So from Copenhagen is a question for Marco. What can we as students do to speed up transition towards a systemic change in education?
What you can do? Well, I think is to recognize that maybe unlike my generation that was made to believe that there are professions that you prepare for through an academic career, and academic career allows you and legitimizes you to exert that profession, that many of the professions we need right now don't exist, and there aren't career paths for it. So I would say students need to be super active in building their own career paths. And I would encourage anybody, for example, who's interested in government, just to be annoyingly active, seeking jobs in the boring parts of the beast of the belly, so they can understand the logics of those and help build bridges very quickly. The sooner we can build that, the quicker. And I think, with all respect to academia, which I've enjoyed very much, the big institutions move a bit at a slower pace. So I think they will have the capacity to build robust systems to meet the scale of demand. But right now that needs to be, in a way, coupled with just proactive activism on a younger generation's belief and things. Because I think we need to talk about what's the clock speed here. What is a window of opportunity? I don't think we have a generation that we can wait. We can wait for the institutions to build new professions and career paths and new ways of governing and preparing a new generation of people to be in positions of leadership. We'll miss the opportunities, right? We need to do that in the next year. When I was in the Prime Minister's office, I said, you have 3 months time. Well, that was 5 years ago, right? Because you will lock yourself out of opportunities for change. You might have the right idea, but the timing's off.
At this point, oh, sorry. Okay. Yeah. So we have to so only one question. Okay. Yeah.
Well, I've actually got 2 questions. Would that be okay?
Just call it one question.
Because I'd have one for Marco and then one for Tanya. Marco, I loved how you could illustrate so clearly the history of our economic growth into like 5 minutes, and now it's happened. And my team is working on finding a solution to reduce poverty in Helsinki the next 5 years. And my question is, how do you see poverty in a city like Helsinki today? Because it certainly means different things than what it meant 100 years ago. And then from Tanya, I would like to ask, is there any statistic information on the economic backgrounds of people who have participated in all of these like big events like Siivouspäivä or Illallinen taivaan alla? So would you see that this participatory service design would be a solution to sort of close this income gap that we see is increasing and bringing people from different financial statuses together?
I'll just very briefly say, I think the poverty question is an interesting one. I think we have a notion, broadly speaking, sorry for being a bit generic, but of progress. And I think we've inherited this idea that each generation is better off than the previous one. And I think the whole idea of sort of retirement and intergenerational responsibility is built towards that. I think we're actually at a tipping point where this next generation will probably be, I don't want to be too doomsday-y here, less educated, less healthy, and less wealthy than the previous one. And it's going to mess with our concept of what progress means. Now, that's not distributed evenly, unfortunately. And so that's where it becomes quite important when we go back to indices and statistics and looking and being proposition based and what are the risk profiles of things, is understand a new way of framing this, because there will be new kinds of ways of thinking about poverty. So I appreciate the way you kind of sort of frame that. Poverty may be actually, I mean, it depends how you want to define it, but being locked out of opportunities for self-fulfillment or participate in society. So by the standard 18th century definition of poverty, you may actually have enough money and enough whatever and whatever, but actually by the new standards, you don't have that. You know, internet access globally is one of those things. You may have people who have enough food and internet, but they don't have internet access. Does that mean that they're locking themselves out of opportunities for growth and self-fulfillment? So this becomes quite complicated, and we're having new kinds of things happen in our society that we aren't even attuned to. I worked a little bit on youth homelessness in the city of Helsinki. It's actually a fairly sizable problem. We're talking about under 10,000 kids, but growing at a rapid pace. They're not visible on any statistics. They're kids moving from small municipalities coming to Helsinki in the hope of jobs or study, and they don't get it. And then they couch surf on people's friends, right? And then they pop up in the statistics 20 years later, and it's too late. So we may have hidden poverty because we don't even have the capacity to see it. And that's why I think a lot of design work, which involves a degree of light ethnography, going into realities and seeing what they are and what are we not seeing, is really important. What are we not seeing right now around poverty in Helsinki?
As I pass the microphone, I strongly recommend you to check Manfred Max Neef's needs theory, which is an amazing alternative to Maslow's white man, top-down, Western needs hierarchy.
Okay. About cleaning day and the dinner, there are some statistics, and we also work like we do client service. So we answer the phone and we talk with people and we answer their messages, and we have a lot of discussion in the Facebook and Facebook group. So we have a knowledge also. But yes, we know that that there are people from all kinds of social backgrounds and people with all kinds of income level. So at least cleaning day and dinner, they have really brought people together. And we also know that there has been a lot of impact for the welfare of the social welfare of the neighborhoods. They are not big things, but still, and examples also for people that I can do this, and I can go out to the street, I can talk to my neighbor, and almost 70% of the participants of cleaning day say that one reason for participating, it's not only recycling, but being there out with other people and socializing. Whether they have impact in poverty, that I don't know, but it would be a longer discussion.
Okay, thank you. As like closing words from you all, Tanya, Idil, and Marco. So the teams are working right now on the Sustainable Development Goals and presenting in the final event on 26 September, where you are also cordially invited. But how would you kind of advise the teams to test and experiment their concepts, like from now till the event, like during these 2 weeks or so?
Chris, no, I don't know. I can only be. I don't know many of the details, so I'm speaking completely out of context, maybe. But whatever you're working on, I would try to find the opportunity to collide it with the messiness of real life. A lot of theories, a lot of models are very useful because they help you organize your thinking and find certain patterns, ways of organizing ideas. But unfortunately, the world is also very messy, and a lot of times, like the city of Helsinki, we want to impose our theoretical logic on the world, hoping that the world will adapt to it. So to have a little bit of that push and pull, whatever you're working on, can you actually put it into a real context at some level, simulate it, prototype it, test it, have somebody else take a whack at it, and see whether the mold you're building actually fits the reality of the issue that you're dealing with. So.
That is amazing advice. I don't know how to top that up, but I guess my advice would be to think at micro scale and macro scale. So I think how I can relate my response to Marco's. Marco is talking about theory and practice, and they should resonate. And my advice to kind of complement it is think in small scale, and don't lose the perspective of the bigger scale, and always again resonate between small and large, short term and long term.
You almost said everything, but one thing what you can also try is the Paulina method. Open a Facebook group for the idea, invite thousands of people there, and start to talk about it. You will learn maybe something.
Hey, this has been absolutely wonderful. Let's give a hand for Tanja, Idil, and Marko.
corresponding channel, which we'll create in a second, to Teams. So you have this afternoon, tomorrow morning, before reflections, to do this.
Mika, can you repeat? They missed the front part. What do they need to do, basically?
They got it now?
I think so.
Okay, good. Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, same thing. So this is like really the problem space. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's it from our side. Closing words. I'll leave that to you. Who wants to share some thoughts? Okay, closing words. Who wants to conclude this session? Okay, thank you for that. Thank you. And thank you. So we'll meet, or we convene 1 o'clock tomorrow in Finnish time, business school. Check out the map. Otherwise, yeah. 1 o'clock tomorrow. Have a nice afternoon, nice morning tomorrow, and see you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry?
It was on mute.
Guys, before you leave, take your chair, keep it, and hang it on the wall. Yeah. Thank you.
You mentioned something.
That sounds good. Yeah, with the food.
So we have Aina in our team, but we've never seen him before her.
Can you leave the name here? I will.
Yeah, I think so.
And
We're a
how
team.
many people are there in your team?
4 plus.
Oh, okay, so this is the fifth one.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, then.
We're team number 6, so you
Okay.
can find it under there.
Okay, so you've never seen a person from day one? So maybe the person's not showing us.
Yeah.
So just operate as 4, and then we'll just exclude this person.
Yeah.
Any other person? Floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Damn it.
Can we confirm one thing?
Hey buddies, can you hear me okay?
He's gonna do a short session on screen, so.
What about now? Sound is off. No.
Oh, can you hear me now? Everything seems to be... You're not picking this up, like... Oh, no, no worries. Nothing?
So tomorrow morning is the work.
So you're supposed to submit that review, like, and I think it's in script.
Okay.
Because we know that some of you have visit this afternoon, so we can expect yeah, so maybe enjoy your visit later. Yeah, see you tomorrow. See you.
What is it? Vaguely. Fantastic. I'm just gonna bring my trusted whiteboard. Okay. What about now? I'm actually looking at myself from the stream at the same time. It's kind of bizarre. Okay. Okay. What is this? Okay, so still okay? Perfect. I'm just gonna look at this just in case. So, like, if you think about like this couple of first couple of days, it's been really about exploring and kind of understanding what is the real challenge here. And now, the purpose with this exercise is to kind of map out the problem space. So, what kind of problems or challenges can you identify within your own SDG? And the idea is that by tomorrow noon, so 11 a.m. Danish time, you should upload 3 pictures or videos each team to a corresponding channel on Teams. And the idea here is that, you know, we can, like, now the teams can share what kind of insights they have gathered from their field work. So it's like really, really low key, like nothing, like no, how do you call it, like no professional editing, but just 3 different problem spaces that each team identifies under each SDG. So it's, yeah, and then like next week, Monday, we start taking a deep dive into which of these problems we actually choose and how do we start validating and developing that into an actionable concept that you will be presenting then on 26th, on Wednesday in Finland, on the 3rd week. So yeah, so this is like the really kind of, now is like the problem definition, fieldwork phase, and the idea here is to kind of try to articulate in visual means what kind of challenges can we identify in each SDG. Does that make sense? And now I wait.
Sorry.